Good? We're good. Let me set a timer so that I don't overrun. Cool. Thank you very much for Cyber Week for having me. Thank you for coming and listening to my talk. My talk is going to be kind of a satellite level view of different kinds of AI risk. Before that, I want to know a little bit about my audience. So raise your hand if you have ever trained a neural network from scratch on your computer. And you raise your hands. Okay, thank you. Raise your hand if you've ever heard about a movie franchise called The Terminator. Thank you. And finally, raise your hand if you know why I'm going to be mentioning paperclips in this talk. One. Cool, excellent. So a little bit about me and my center. We are a center in Cambridge called the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. We were started by an astronomer, a philosopher, and a founder of Skype to study scientifically plausible scenarios in which everyone dies. It's a very cheerful job. We look at AI because in some potential very long-term cases, this might be relevant, but this is not going to be the majority of those risks, and so it would be good to kind of disambiguate. So imagine in like 5 seconds in your brain, kind of the first picture that comes to your mind when you think about risks from AI. And hopefully what you came up with is a little bit like this mishmash on that side, the far side. It's kind of a mix of things that you've heard of in the news and things that you've seen in the movies and things that are happening in other places in the world. And the aim of this talk is by the end of it, you should have this nice way of packing things, different risks into different locations. All of them are important, but perhaps on different time scales and to different people. So we're going to build this table over the next, 16 minutes. And by the end of it, you should be able to not only know all of these different 9 segments of the AI risk map, but also be able to explain it to someone else, which is useful because it's a confusing topic and there are many things here. So I was told in the army that you should break everything down into 3. You're an advanced audience, so we're going to break everything into 3 twice. So we're going to have 9 things. The first way to break risks into 3 is to ask, when are those risks going to happen? So what is risk? Risk is potential for harm or bad things. So when are the bad things going to happen from AI? And I'm going to use AI in slightly more liberal sense than the previous speaker. It's just machines that are capable to do cognitively challenging tasks. So I'm happy to include calculators. So we can go all the way back to the 80s, but maybe we'll focus on machine learning and kind of the current phase of AI that gets everyone very excited. So we have things that are happening now. Soon are things that we kind of, if you ask an advanced machine learning engineer, they will tell you, yeah, I could probably build this thing for you, but maybe there is no business case. Or maybe it's going to take 10 years to get regulation approved to deploy this thing at scale in the world. And later, I'm going to talk about things where you take the top scientists today and they tell you, this might never happen, but here's an idea of how you might approach this problem. Or maybe our startup is amazing and we'll get there in 5 years, but other people don't trust them, right? So we don't really know how to solve these problems yet, but from everything we know about physics and psychology and computer science, they are potentially plausible. And then the other way is to break down risks is by type. This is a breakdown that I've adopted from Remco Zwetlut and Ellen Defoe's paper, which breaks down risks into accident, which is the AI system is causing harm that was not intended by the user or the developer. Malicious risks, which is there is harm that is being intended by the user and maybe also the developer. And systemic risks, where you have lots of systems, they are roughly doing what they intended, not each one of them is kind of happening as you intended, but collectively they generate some harm to society. So we're going to start with the accident risks, and I can go over some of these relatively quickly because we have had great talks before. So in the top one, we've already heard, these are statistical systems that are very good at machine vision, right? They can tell apart cats from dogs. They couldn't do it before 2012. That's very exciting. This is what the ImageNet thing that has been mentioned. But of course, if you make a mistake between cupcakes and chihuahuas, that's very different in the real world than making a mistake between your friends who are African Americans and gorillas. And often when engineers train those systems, they don't introduce those different costs into the training. And this is something that we should be mindful of because this has real world consequences. When Google did this, they got a lot of bad flack, and people like me mentioned this in talks, and they deserve it even though they actually handled it very nicely on the day. But they should have seen it coming. At the bottom, we'll see an example of a Tesla in autopilot mode crashing into the fence, and you could say Tesla says we are not fully self-driving. You should have your hands on the wheel and you should pay attention all the time. But then they also call their product autopilot. So maybe they should take a little bit of the responsibility that when those things crash, that's a bad thing. On the other hand, humans crash cars into sides of the road all the time. So the really interesting question here about are we entirely not tolerant of accidents from AI systems, or do we only, are we happy enough for them to have a lower accident rates than humans? And that's a discussion that we need to have. Then going into the near term, there is AI being used in social justice. The next speaker is going to talk greatly about this, so I'm going to just skip all this except to say the same issues of bias in training that exist in the Google Photos case become much worse when you look at those things. And then what happens if we're going to use AI in military settings? So here I have an example of someone looking at an early warning system in the nuclear case, and we've heard talk about false alarms. We know that there is a history of nuclear false alarms that happened because of faulty chips, because of sun reflecting off the moon, because of weather balloons, and it needed a human operator to intervene. It's great to hear Israel INCD talking about government intervening and making sure that systems are robust to those kinds of accidents. I wanted to mention that there is also another option, which is sometimes you just don't want to introduce machine learning into your systems. At least you are extremely confident that they're not going to fail in ways that are going to be catastrophic. And this kind of risk analysis is something that we need to see a lot more in the AI domain. And finally, so people said that mentioning games is good, so I'm mentioning a game. This is a game called Universal Paperclips that I would recommend you play. It's extremely addictive and takes about 2 days to complete. And it's a game rendition of a thought experiment by a philosopher called Nick Bostrom that says, what happens if one day we get to AI systems that are not just narrow, that they can do everything that a human can do, including making better AI system, and you take such a system and you tell it, please make me more paperclips, because I have a paperclip factory and it's not making enough money, and then it starts, and you think it's going to just kind of move things around in your factory and make it 20% more efficient. Instead, what it does is goes and trades on the stock market, then buys out a bunch of AI companies, makes itself extremely smart, takes over the world, and turns the entire world, including the people on it, into paperclips. It doesn't hate you, it doesn't love you. It just, you're made of atoms that could be used to make paperclips. But this is extremely sci-fi-ish, but already starting to think about these problems raises interesting problems that we can do serious work on, even if those are risks that are decades away. So what are people doing about such risks? We've heard this great stuff about learnability. This could help us tell in advance where the accidents might happen. You can use domain experts to help you deal with some of these accidents. There's also technical research work that's being done on those risks. So the example of this boat that's going around in loops and catching on fire is from a blog post by OpenAI, a research lab in San Francisco. And they tried to train this boat to go around the racetrack and collect as many points and play the game well. What the AI agent playing the game found is that you can make more points by just going around in this tight loop, collecting these packets of money that have been left in the ocean and having the boat catch on fire. And this is called reward hacking, and there is interesting general research in how you avoid reward hacking in reinforcement learning agents. On the right, you see a small example from a paper by DeepMind, part of the other AI grid worlds paper that takes a bunch of these things that could go wrong with AI agents and try to make very small, simplified examples that researchers can study. In this particular one, this is a problem of minimizing side effects. So the agents want to go from one corner to the other, there is an obstacle in the middle, and the aim is to generally train systems that put the system back in a way that is the way they found the world, other than the thing they're trying to achieve. You can also imagine a house cleaning robot. It wants to go from one corner to the other. There is a vase in the middle of the room. One way is to go through the vase breaks, and you want to be able to train agents to kind of move the vase aside and then put it back without having to say in advance, we care about vases. Because if you have to code into machines all the things we care about, it will become too hard to deploy such systems. And then for the long-term risk, I don't want to mention too much about this, except this is not just crazy people who are worried about this. Go and read Nick Bostrom's Superintelligence. It's a very interesting account of what happens when we have machines that are smarter than humans. And particularly he goes through all of the immediate objections that you might have to the idea that this will either never happen or that will be extremely easy to deal with. And then you can look at some of the Machine Intelligence Research Institute work that kind of really in a mathematical decision theoretic way break down some of the assumptions that we have about current AI systems and show that they no longer hold for these super advanced systems, and we will probably need to change fundamental computer science and machine learning if we want to be able to design those systems in a way that is safe. So those are accident risks. Onwards to malicious risks. What do we have today? Again, I can go over this fairly briefly because previous speakers have done a great job. So at the top, we're seeing a social engineering attack that was done for espionage. This is a fake LinkedIn profile. The interesting thing about this is that this person in the image does not exist. This is a face that was imagined, dreamed by a computer system. There's a general set of algorithms called generative adversarial networks that are able to dream up these things, because if you can tell apart cats from dogs, and you can also do a lot of trial and error until you get the right answer, then you can do lots of trial and error until you can no longer tell apart from a fake face from a real face, and then you can generate these things. 2017 was where NVIDIA showed that they can do these things really well. This is from 2019, cyber attackers are already using this. At the bottom, you're seeing a sniper rifle that has a precision targeting scope that basically says you can mark the target, and then from here on, the batch of sensors on the system and the computer will make sure that you no longer lose sight of the target. You can go and you buy it now. It's mostly sold for hunting. But the general idea here is that if we can have machines do things that people can do, then you can take things that only a few humans can do, few experts, generalize it into computers, and distribute it across the world at a fairly low price. Mostly this is great. We heard about how AI is great. If you do it for education or for health, that's wonderful. If you do it for being able to use a sniper rifle, that's maybe not so great. Then going a bit into the near term, and I think this should probably all move into the now phase, being at Cyber Week. We heard about targeted spear phishing. We also have fairly advanced image recognition. Image recognition could be great if you have the consent of the users and you're protecting your private space. Maybe less good if you're using it to surveil an entire population in a way that they are not perfectly happy with. So you can take one image of everyone who was at the demonstration and then 1 week later show up at their home and arrest them because you have a database of everyone. And we need to talk about how we're going to deal with these risks because they're coming. Right? The capacity to do these things is going to be with us. And long-term risks, there are no good papers on this yet, and that's good because it's an extremely depressing topic, but go to your nearest sci-fi shelf and you will hear lots about that. What are we doing about this? Well, we and some colleagues launched this report called The Malicious Use of AI that covers a lot of this in merely 100 pages. Go and read it, it's great. Also, people are doing technical work on this. So this is an example from a company called DeepTrace that is beginning to use AI to detect those fake faces and also these face swaps, the deepfakes that we've heard about. But this is going to be a race. So we've gone from a world where you can kind of trust videos and images sometimes to a world where you need to use AI tools and you're always at a race telling apart what's fake from what's real. Also, what we're trying to do is push some norms around the malicious use of AI. And here I want to stop and say something to this particular group because I was extremely concerned that the opening talk talked about AI is a giant race for military dominance. Imagine in the 70s, the biologists who first did recombinant DNA said, we have made these advances in biology and we're going to now have a race for military dominance in biology. They didn't do that. Instead, they had a conference at Asilomar where they said, we are going to be extremely responsible how we develop these technologies. Now, I come from Israel. I know it's going to be super naive to say this will never be used in a military domain, but let's mostly talk about the cooperative benefits of these technologies, working together as a community. There are few enough AI researchers at the moment that we can set some limits about how we want this technology to do, because we can choose now, right? In about 5 to 10 years, we will no longer be able to choose. So you see some examples of this. At the top, you see a pledge by the Future of Life Institute of a bunch of AI developers and organizations saying we will never develop lethal autonomous weapon systems. There is also discussion in the United Nations around this. 27 countries have committed to never developing such weapons, and they're trying to push for an international ban on such weapons. I am skeptical that they will succeed, but it's good to be talking about these things because maybe we can get some rules for the game instead of everyone just trying to get into everyone else's OODA loop and on the way creating lots of collateral damage. At the bottom, we see an example that this will be extremely familiar to people who come from the cyber world, which is we're developing all of these new technologies. They have potential misuses. maybe we should warn some people and give them some time to develop defenses before we release all of our models and all of our code and all of our recipes to the world, which is the norm in AI. So OpenAI tried to do this with GPT-2. They said we have a language model that could generate paragraphs of text that at first glance look like what a human would write. You can tell if you pay attention. But we think this is going to be really bad for online discourse and for fake news, so we're not going to release our entire model, or we're going to release it in stages. And some people on Twitter said that they did a great thing, and some people on Twitter said that they did a terrible thing. A couple of weeks ago, an undergraduate in Switzerland replicated their giant model, and then after talking to them decided to also not release. So I think there is now a movement in this space, and people from the cybersecurity can really help that norm propagate of, if you're going to do research that has potential harmful applications, maybe you want to be careful about how you spread it. So we've covered accident and malicious. Now let's talk a little bit about systemic. So I'm really grateful that the speaker before me talked about hype, so I can go over this fairly briefly. This is a graph from Google Trends that shows over the last 5 years, machine learning in blue, artificial intelligence in red, and cybersecurity in yellow. We're always chasing the brand new technology. AI is not just hype. We can genuinely do things that we couldn't do 10 years ago, but it's not the case that the solution to every single problem in the world is AI. It is not the case that if you put an AI solution, it's never going to make any mistake and it's going to work 24/7 perfectly. You still need the domain experts, and there are still many things broken in the world that you should be paying attention to. This is extremely, not so much in Israel. Israel is very aware that cyber is a thing that you should be paying attention to, but I talk to policymakers in other parts of the world and they're like, oh, there was this cyber thing, but now there is this AI thing, which is an entirely different thing, and we should pay attention to that instead, and also blockchain. And it's frustrating because, the world is dangerous in all sorts of ways, and there are fairly scary things out there, including nuclear weapons, and focusing just on the next hot thing is not the best. And hopefully that will die down the way that some of the blockchain hype has died down. Then as we move into the near term, and near here is broad, what happens when we are generally able to automate a bunch of tasks that currently humans do? So what happens when we get to fully autonomous driving? People who are super excited will say 5 years. People who are more skeptical say maybe 10 or 20 years. It mostly depends on the regulation. But what happens with all of these people who currently drive trucks and taxis? Yes, some economists say, look, this is the labor fallacy. There will always be new jobs. AI will make new jobs. I am not seeing all of these taxi drivers retraining as Python developers or even data entry specialists. So we need to think large scale about how we deal with these problems, and don't just throw around words like universal basic income, because you need to do the math on how it's going to work. And there's this great video by CGP Grey called Humans Need Not Apply on YouTube. I would strongly recommend it. And finally, in the long term, so what we're seeing here is a picture of humans that look like zombies and looking at their phones, and you could say this is a now problem. But this is an illustration of 2 points that I want to make. One is humans want different things. Some of our desires are fairly basic. Some of our desires are fairly complex. If we have systems that are able at scale to fulfill our basic needs, and they may be very addictive, and they may be extremely good at giving us our basic needs, we may give up on pursuing those more advanced desires. It's also much easier to tailor to people's basic needs than it is to tailor to their complex needs. So maybe everyone kind of feels great within their social bubble and have really cheap food delivered directly to their bed and so on, but no one does basic research or aims for the stars anymore. That seems like a fairly bad outcome that we might end up with. Another thing is no one promises us that these computers that evolution gave us are sufficiently advanced to understand the world around us. We've done a fairly amazing job with science, but machine learning can find all of these patterns in the world, can make great predictions. What happens if some of those predictions are excellent, right? They have very low error rates and they tell us exactly what we need to do, but they cannot explain them to us. Would we want to use them? And maybe it's up to us to decide whether we want them or not. And on that, what do we do about this? Organizations like the Partnership on AI are organizing experts to talk about these, and they have great work, and maybe some Israeli organizations should join them. Countries are getting into this, international organizations are getting into this. There is lots of places to talk about these things if you so desire. Remember this. If you have any questions, come and find me afterwards. Thank you.